Where are we going? Welcome to this exclusive podcast produced by Spirit Watch Ministries that will show where life in our darkening times is now turning and how you can avoid the detours of deception through the hope of biblical truth. The Lord Jesus in Matthew 24 warned us over 2 millennia ago and how urgently we need to heed him now. Our host is Pastor Rafael Martinez, a seasoned Northwest Indiana-based minister, intercessor, and counter-cult apologist who will help you discern the journey of change we're all on as the last day of the last days now winds down. For more information, check out our Facebook page and our website at spiritwatch.org. Now, here's Pastor Rafael.
Hello, I'm Rafael Martinez, a minister within the Church of God Cleveland Movement and a director of Spirit Watch Ministries, an outreach providing biblical discernment in a time of deception. Our podcast is called Where Are We Going? And seeks to supply answers to a great question that a lot of people are asking these days about the direction our world is presently taking. Our days are increasingly shadowed by anxiety, violence, deception, and oppression at so many levels. And it's so difficult to really understand where our world is heading. So from one small portion of that, the podcast, Where Are We Going, is something that we're providing that will do all it can to shine light and hope where we possibly can in the area of spiritual discernment. These podcasts will give you a solidly biblical perspective on our deceptive times of trouble. We've been covering cultism, deception, and spiritual abuse issues since we've launched a little over a year ago, and an upcoming podcast will touch on the other deeper issues driving these sadly all too visible signs of even deeper trouble in human society. So we really hope you'll keep joining us for those as well. It's easy to find our podcast on the internet at our spiritwatch.org ministry website or on Facebook using the search term Spirit Watch Ministries. Links to them will be on our homepage and our Facebook page, as well as our blog, the Spirit Watch Unchained blogspot link. We'll post them all there for easy access with a couple of mouse clicks. So just bookmark us. Share the links with friends, family, your tax collectors, your teachers, your mechanics. Help us build our audience if we can. We're now currently being carried by both Amazon and Spotify as well. So we are so grateful to have folks coming from there, and we thank you for visiting us today. We hope that you'll find something worthy to listening and to bookmark us and come back again.
Today we're pressing on with our Ministry of Discernment that focuses on the Xenos Dwell movement based in Columbus, Ohio. As you've certainly gathered by now, we consider Xenos to be an abusive house church movement started by 2 college students named Dennis McCallum and Gary DeLashford way back in 1970. Its growth over the years came as it targeted Ohio State University college students and other college students in the area very quietly for decades. During those years, thousands of people have been exposed in exclusively private church social settings to influences that I think can be best described as toxic and damaging cultism, easily as bad as anything I've seen in any other cult that we've examined, including Remnant Fellowship and et al., so to speak. Unfortunately, it's a horror that's been overlooked and ignored by the media, the church, and the world at large for over 50 years. But in the last few years, thanks to the courage of many former members who are speaking out, a day of reckoning is now becoming a daily occurrence for Xenos. There's a collective of voices being raised up in the public squares of the internet and beyond, and we're just glad to have a small part in helping some of those voices be heard. Now, our work on a yet-to-be-released documentary on Xenos last December 2021 helped open a floodgate of volunteers who wanted to tell their stories to us. And that especially took place after the NBC investigative journalism came out back in March. So our guest today is one of those, and she also happened to be, if I may say so, one of the leading agitators of that collective, named Katie Reneker. Katie, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks, Rafael. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here, and I really appreciate what you've been sharing with us and our conversations. And you just helped me, again. It's just always good to talk to people to understand where you're at and understand that what you're objectives and passions really are regarding something like this. You started just a few months ago a wonderful website. I'd like you to tell us about a little more. And it's a website that gives us information about your journey in and out of Xenos Dwell and so much more. So tell us a little bit about that and what's your response been like.
Yeah, so I started a website. The website is called dwellchurchcolumbusisaCult.com. And, I really started that after following the NBC4 investigative reports that came out, and then also seeing some of the interviews that you did, Raphael, with Megan Cox, where you interviewed, two of the leaders in Dwell Community Church, Conrad Hilario and Kate Mizell. I have personal experience dating back, some 20 years with the church, and it deeply impacted my life. And so when I saw this stuff coming back into the news, it gave me an opportunity, I think, to reevaluate and relook at what had actually happened to me. And, it started to become clear as I looked into it that, what I maybe always believed this idea that what had happened to me within Xenos Dwell was relatively unique. But what I found from looking into the investigative journalist reports, also on Mark Kennedy's website, xenosisaCult.com,
right?
Just reading some of those stories, it became, I think, so clear to me that this wasn't a unique experience I had because I had been, very invested in church and fairly senior in the organization as a young person, that this had actually happened to, hundreds, if not thousands of individuals, over the past several decades, who have interacted with this group. That really made me sort of rethink, my own experiences and then what I wanted to share about it. It's certainly something that, my experience in the church has deeply impacted who I am as a person, how I think, the things that I'm afraid of, how I form relationships, and see that sort of damage propagated across hundreds of other people, who maybe don't have the resources to even understand what's happened to them. It made me really want to add my voice to the mix and use some of my skills in terms of understanding the church, from an intellectual or an academic perspective, the type of analysis that goes into even understanding that group, right? And hoping to add a little bit of information. I think Mark's website is really good at xenosisaCult.com in getting people's stories out there of the pain that people have suffered as a result of this organization. I wanted to add something maybe a little complimentary that had a little bit more analysis.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And go ahead. I'm sorry. I interrupted you. Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're fine. I just wanted to add a little bit more sort of rigorous analysis of things about what are the structural issues in the church that have led to this sort of outcome? Sure. Why is it people in the church have such a hard time understanding and seeing some of this as abuse? And then kind of just add some validation for, individuals who are coming out on the other side of it. I've experienced it. It's incredibly lonely. It's isolating. There's a huge loss of identity, sense of shame and embarrassment that really constitutes this type of religious abuse. And there aren't a lot of resources for people to deal with it. And so often people feel, that their experiences have been trivialized, demeaned, that what they experienced wasn't real or somehow their fault, which are, I think, hallmarks of abuse in general, but get even trickier and murkier when, you look at a group that has operated relatively subtly in the way that Xenos Dwell has. Right. And so I wanted to add a little bit of that in hopes of speaking out against the church and what I've experienced, but also providing some validation and, even helping individuals who have been harmed by the group understand and process what's happened to them, right? To know that others have been there before them, what they experienced was real,
right?
And understand, what the context is and how they fit into it.
It's a great site. I mean, I haven't begun to even really dig into it the way I really, really want to. It's not something you can walk in there and browse into it. As it's well written, it's well done. It's really there to help, like as you said, do what you're done. You've sit and you really have helped provide an additional level of context, of interpretive context, that I think will help anybody understand Xenos as well, along with just the wonderful analysis that Mark provides through the xenosasoccult.com website. I mean, he's a guy I'm hoping to have on the podcast real soon as well, and his work on that side is easily to the leadership of Xenos, the same kind of labor that my own work through the ourspiritwatch.org site has been through the besieged leadership of the Remnant Fellowship cult. It's great to have met him and have been a time together in that brief time last December. And I'm hoping that, well, at some point, we'll all find some quiet place in the German village in Columbus to unpack things at some point or somewhere, because there's just so much to share and really connect with over. There's so much that I think that we are all on the same page about, that it's helpful, I think, sometimes just to really focus better. But it's just, like I said, two great websites, and there's increasingly more and more voices coming out. I've heard of a YouTube channel coming up, which there's going to be people who are going to be putting video testimonies. I don't know how far it's got along, but I do see it's gotten started. So, of course, Reddit and Twitter are always out there. There's some great sources there. So yeah, this is a collective that is speaking truth to power, and the powers that be at Xenos need to understand it's not going away. Okay, they can analyze it and do papers on it and curse the ground we walk on. But it doesn't matter. It's not going to change the plain truth of what's going on. So now you did share with us that you were a member of Xenos from 1998 until 2006, and that you were being groomed for leadership there. So who were those key individuals who you were being discipled by, and how far on their mobile path were you aspiring to?
Yeah, so I mean, just broadly, I came into Xenos sort of in my middle school years. I was brought by my best friend at the time from middle school, and was part of a small group of girls in a girls' cell group that just really desired to know God, answer questions about spirituality. I did in fact have a church background in history. My parents are religious, and I was raised in a Lutheran church. So, by Xenos standards, certainly more conventional church upbringing, but I was very serious and had been exposed to God in that context as well. Mm-hmm. So I was not, as you might say, unchurched when I came into Xenos.
You weren't a pagan, so.
I have been called a pagan even within the church.
Right.
I think some of that does speak, I think, to the elitism of the organization, which is one of the things many of the critics have pointed out about the group, is that, there really is a sense that, for me growing up in a regular sort of Sunday oriented Lutheran church with a steeple was inferior to what Xenos had to offer.
Right.
And though there were strengths, I think, about the church that drew me into Xenos, of what I was looking for, particularly when it came to sort of an intellectual understanding and having my questions treated with seriousness, about who God was, what God wanted for our lives, and what sort of community we could be a part of. I think that was a really strong point in Xenos, and that's the point at which I entered it. I was looking for something committed, something serious, something more than just, what I could get out of a Sunday school as a middle schooler in sort of an ordinary community church. Mm-hmm. I think that my parents' church offered me quite a lot, but Xenos came in and offered a much higher level of that, which is, I think, one of the strengths of the church and also one of its downfalls. And so happy to go into details about, my experience over time, but I think from a broad perspective, the intensity within Xenos ramps from, say, middle school, where it's relatively benign. Although there are, certain elements of the culture that start to get formed in terms of how you think and how you speak and how you act as a part of the ideology. But that really starts to ramp up in high school, as I think, a lot of the guests you've had on the podcast have expressed. And then the height of that, I think, is really reached in college, which is, as you mentioned in the introduction, that's sort of the bread and butter of what Xenos does is, trying to win and convert people in sort of those early college years when people are at their most vulnerable point.
Right.
And so yeah,
right.
so.
Yeah, you wrote an absolutely riveting document about your journey in and out of Xenos, and I think that it goes well over 10 pages of 8-point fonted print that I read in one gulp when you sent me a link to it, and that really is an incredible document that's right there, I think, up front on your homepage there to look at, and I really believe, that, like I said, it is just so eloquently and so forcefully delivered such an incredible amount of very focused insight upon your time getting in and out, and you hit those very things. You spoke about that, and that it's just an incredible amount of intrusion that the church takes when it lures you in, doesn't it? I mean, it really just tries to insinuate itself into every part of your life in a way that's at times is welcoming, I think, as you mentioned, and enriching, but then at the same time it's also outrageous and unbelievable. I mean,
yeah, and so I think, thanks for mentioning the paper I wrote. I mean, a lot of that, it was a labor of love of it's been 16 years, almost to the day, since I left Xenos, which was, a very difficult decision for me and is probably the, formative experience of my life in terms of drama and who I am. And I've spent a lot of the past, 2 decades really thinking about what happened there, recovering from it, understanding how it impacts who I am as a person, and then tying that back to understanding the structural issues within the church itself. And so that paper, I really wrote that sort of at the outset of a rethinking of this, when the interviews and different things came out earlier this year. And I think, I think what I wanted to get across in that is, yes, the immense control of the organization, but also to get across some of the subtleties and nuances that lead people to be indoctrinated and act in a way that, people within the church, for the most part, are acting with very good intentions to follow God, intentions to love people. And I think that gets missed a lot. Mm-hmm. There is, having to reconcile these very difficult things to say, yes, I believe that what happened to me and many others in the church constitutes abuse. And yet at the same time, I can understand and hold this idea that the ideology within the church does not recognize it as abuse. They do not think they did anything wrong. And so in that paper, I really wanted to express to, people within the church, and then also people who have been really wounded by the organization, to sort of, show how that even arises and where that comes from, and give some validity to it, right?
Right. And that's I think where the lion's share of discussion we'd like to really take our podcast up to in the next few weeks to really address. I mean, we've certainly held, and we certainly still want to hear from people that would like to share their stories, because every story is important. Every person's life deserves to be opened up if they so desire to share in such a way that helps them process what they've been through. I mean, I think that's why that's one reason why we do the podcast is not only just to, provide a source for that, but for allowing people to just be able to tell their stories. But at the same time, there's a method to our methodology. We definitely want to take our discussion and dialogue up to a newer level on that. And I appreciate your saying that, because the amount of intrusion, as I said, that goes into your time in a group like Xenos just becomes so innocuous. It's so ordinary. It just seems so right. It feels so proper for people to request things of that. And there is one thing I did want to ask in regards to your involvement. I commented last week in our interview with Nina Lombardo that it seems that every single ex-Xenos survivor has made it clear that there's a database that the church leaders maintain on everyone. There just seems to be an unreal amount of personal information that you're required to generate in your interaction with Xenos that gets recorded in some way, whether it's in a Google form or just plain old good old fashioned crib notes. You're required to provide that as a part of the process of discipling, and it's actually more of a model of indoctrination. So, and two of those documents are what are called the spiritual gifts assessment and the temperament inventory. They seem to be two of the most long-reaching ones from what I've shared with other people about. I've been told that your place in Xenos is pretty much determined by those tests you're supposed to take, and you can easily be typecast, if we may use that word, into a specific form of career path in Xenos by whatever results are from those inventories. Can you comment on that? And have you found that to be your experience?
Yeah, I think it varies depending on probably the emotional maturity of the individuals who are propagating and using those documents. And so I think across say a 6,000 person church that has a very flat structure and a lot of leaders who are relatively immature in their faith, or even just, emotionally and socially in their lives because they're relatively young. You have, people just out of high school leading in areas that require incredible emotional depth and nuance. So I think that probably the application of those varies dramatically. I've seen some of those documents and have even perhaps used them even in my time at Xenos. I was both discipled by supposedly more mature woman in the church, and I also discipled a woman who was younger than myself. And so those are tools that the church propagates, and I think that they can be used in a really negative way. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I do think that it certainly speaks to the high level of control or interest in individuals. And I think you're right. There is certainly typecasting. I think that people might defend those documents and say, look, Xenos Dwell is a high commitment church and we care very much about your spiritual walk with God. And it almost takes on sort of a corporate level, that those documents look a lot like, things I've seen in the corporate world where you're evaluating employees and their performance and their satisfaction, right? And so there is a level of that then is brought into the spiritual dimension, which I think has, is very open to potential abuse, especially in the hands of immature leadership. But, fundamentally, I think it also speaks to that high level of invasiveness of the group. I mean, you might call it high commitment, and maybe when worked out or practiced perfectly, maybe it is something laudable about a church. However, when you're practicing that level of invasiveness, that level of control over individuals, that level of assessment, and commentary and intrusion, there is a huge opportunity for you to cross over that line of what's appropriate, especially when, you know, we're moving. This isn't a job you can quit, right? We've put this into a emotional and spiritual dimension that touches the deepest parts of who people are. Right.
Yeah, this is your eternal destiny. Okay, this isn't like moving from IBM to Whirlpool. I mean, this is for keep. This is for eternity.
Right. And so, I mean, I think, again, and you see a lot of this in the church. I think, you know, in terms of the problems you see, you know, Xenos likes to say that they're this New Testament biblical style church, but, you know, I kind of look around and say, I don't know, that looks a lot more like 20th century capitalism and a corporation to me. Right.
Right.
This is, you know, there's very much an emphasis on sort of this high commitment, high intellectual, high rationalism type of church. And that, you know, when you take our American culture and you put that into a realm of spirituality, you get long checklists and evaluations and ratings of how good or poorly you're doing. And people discuss your performance and review it and want to know, you know, how many people you've converted to God this year. That's part of what drives the culture of the organization, and that keeps such close people. And so I really do. I think that escalates again. You know, you go from something that, you know, in middle school may just be a benign, you know, you have fun with a girls group on Friday nights and, you know, learn about God and the Bible. And, you know, it's relatively innocuous and maybe a lovely thing. But as you start to move into high school and then especially into college, people are being identified, whether through a form or not. There's a culture that identifies a certain type of person to get into leadership. And I can look across the eldership that exists in the church today. And a lot of those people are people I knew or was raised alongside, when I was in high school and in early college. And they all have the same personality type. There's a black and white type A, idealistic, intellectually rational and driven personality type that drives towards the very top of this organization. And you see that almost everywhere I think, you know, one of the key problems in the church even is that it inherently lacks balance. That when you get a lot of these certain people at the top, we're not necessarily following a Christly lifestyle. We're following a lifestyle that emulates those at the top and believing confusing that with what it is to follow God.
Right. Shepherds who are supposed to be shepherds become CEOs. COOs. They became executive officers of a corporation, and it's a model driven from corporate America. And that's exactly one of the things that when I was in Bible college that I just was found so detestable when I look around in evangelicalism back in the 1980s, and then that's a long time ago, but still, that whole model was becoming a part of the modern church growth movement, in which you have focus groups and you have retreats where you do exercises and blackboards where you park information. I mean, it's all this brainstorming concept in which a vision is imposed upon a bunch of people, and as a part of a body politic, that's the way it is. Okay, you literally play follow the leader, and that's sadly what I've seen in the modern church, and that's not even including the cultic dynamic yet. Okay, that's just the way people appear to be led these days, and that's why the name of our podcast is "Where Are We Going?" Because I asked that question very deliberately. It says, "Where in the world are we going in this crazy world?" And Xenos is just one example of that. It really is. So as you got deeper into Xenos, more committed, more involved, you ultimately found that belonging in such a place is an exercise of what I call carrot sticking. Carrot sticking is a rather cruel process in which you induce a beast of burden to keep pulling a load or bearing a rider. but just holding over its head out of reach a piece of food that it pushes ahead to try to eat. So there's always a bit of that tempting carrot and a whole lot more stick in cults for those recruits. And they hold something out in front of you to chase after that beckons you. What were some of those moments that for you kept you moving on? Even though maybe you had questions, maybe your experience wasn't lining up with what the ideals you're being told to live by weren't quite there, but what were some of those moments in as you got more and more involved or being groomed for leadership? What were some of those moments like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. And, even taking, the carrot and the stick example of how you drive people forward, when you move that up into a spiritual dimension, it gets very complex, right?
Yeah,
and so,
sure does. Mm-hmm.
And I think in high school is where I really started to become indoctrinated in the ideology and the system of the church. And of course I was young and impressionable, and I mistook that for real Christianity or real religion or real faith or real God, right? So for me, always, and I think it depends on the individual, but for me, I was running towards God. God was the carrot, right?
Right.
Xenos provided the mold that I was supposed to run within, right?
Right.
They provided the metric system. So I wanted to be close to God, which was the fundamental desire. And I think you can see this in the overarching pattern of what I would call, the real structural problem and the abuse that exists within the church is that people start because they want community, they want meaning, they want purpose, they want God, which are all these things that exist in the spiritual dimension. And Xenos says, yes, we can give you those things. And then they set out a system of an obstacle course of hoops to jump through and very black and white systems of accomplishment and success. And
Right.
they say, do these things. If you look this way, if you achieve these things, that means that you'll be closer to God, or you've done what God wanted, or you're more spiritual, or you're a good person, or, you really matter in this world. I mean, and even some of that falls into this distinction between high commitment church and low commitment, Sunday Lutheran church, right? Where, Xenos says those Sunday Lutherans, they're not as close to God. Being
Right.
close to God implies this being a good worker bee and increasing your knowledge of the Bible, being able to teach others, being able to convert people, maintaining high standards of moral and in particular sexual purity. There are all of these components that become, the fundamental desire is maybe to have community, meaning, love, purpose, and to know God, right? But then the structure they set up is where that's problematic. And so
Right.
in order to feel like you're doing those things, you need to meet all of these exhaustive standards that come along with the church. And, so I've talked a little bit about it, but there's literally no limit to what you can be asked to give up or to submit or to do for the church.
Would part of that course obviously be part of the coursework you're required to do to become a leader?
Yeah,
I mean, everybody's supposed to be a leader. You're supposed to be driven to be these cutting edge elite vanguards of spiritual truth. So therefore, to get that way in Xenos, you have to take all your leadership classes. Isn't that a carrot and stick kind of moment?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Look, I think, whether it's the corporate world or whether it's Xenos, there are bad corporations who don't know how to motivate their people and don't run well as organizations and have terrible cultures. And, Xenos is a weird church, so it looks like a corporation, and they're also would be bad if they were a corporation. They have a terrible culture. And part of that is this black and white ideology. Black and white. Being a Christian, we can tell if you're obviously good or obviously bad, right? Did you take the leadership classes?
Mm-hmm.
Did you time for them? Did you do all of them? Did you do them quickly? Did you take them when you were in high school, even though they're really set up to be sort of a college level type, institution? It's like they've created their own, academy or mini university within the church, which, isn't inherently wrong in and of itself.
Right.
It's perhaps alarming from the indoctrination level and not getting external information. But, all of that is set up to say, here are some easy things. It's black and white. You took the courses or you didn't, right? You filled out the form and you checked the boxes or you didn't. You give money to the church or you didn't. There's some driving towards, I think, that black and white nature that is a part of the culture of the church, right? So they might preach and want to be nuanced of what that looks like, but they failed ultimately as a culture. And the culture is very much right and wrong, black and white. This is what you're supposed to do. And there's a culture that's set up like not just a carrot and a stick, that of course it feels great to take all the classes and pass them and then you're more spiritual, right? But there's also this, a race to the end and who can get there the quickest. You're expected even at a high school level. It's, not uncommon for, sophomores in high school to be taking these internal college level-ish Bible classes that the church is offering. And there's a pressure, an internal pressure, that doesn't even need to be said out loud. That there's a pressure of punishment and reward that encourages people to do that thing, right? If you take the classes as a sophomore, your spiritual leaders and the adults in the group will applaud you for being, incredible and mature and following God. The high commitment model says the more committed you are, the better you are. Right. The more closer you are to God. And so, that's why you see a lot of the people who tell these stories, where they've come into conflict with the system and they've been abused. A lot of it is because they fundamentally have a conflict with this high commitment model that really is an infinite ask. There is no end to it. You can always do it faster, better, more. There's really no limitation. There's no stopping point, right? And so people come into conflict with that, and depending on your capacities as an individual, your abilities, your past traumas, your aptitude, and then even how you just want to live your life.
Exactly. Down to what work you do and everything, right?
Right, exactly. And so if you fail at any level of expectation along that system and are viewed as not doing enough or what you should be doing or what your peers or your mentors or the church leadership thinks you're doing, it's painted as, an embarrassing failure before God. It's a failure of your heart to be directed towards the right things. And so that's when you get into that structure of spiritual abuse, right? You have people come to the church and say, I love God and I want to follow God. And you say, okay, well, here's an entire obstacle course to run.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
And then when you fail that obstacle course, or you step to the side and say, I'm tired and I don't feel like doing this anymore, I don't have time, or I have other priorities that are important, the church will turn around and say, you weren't committed enough to God. Your heart is wrong. This is a spiritual failure, right? And the shame and embarrassment and complication that comes along with all of that, that's what leads to these hundreds of stories of abuse that you hear. Right. All centered around that structural model as being problematic. Right. And there's potentially nothing wrong with a high commitment religious tradition or faith in and of itself. It could be practiced quite beautifully. Unfortunately, the high commitment models have a tendency to cross the line into really unhealthy territory. And the church is, in the senior leadership, is most definitely morally responsible for making sure that doesn't happen. And unfortunately, 5 decades in this church, there has been a lot of crossing over that line. Right. And you see in these countless stories that are heartbreaking.
Right. And that's what, the gripping part of it is. I'm not here just to be, we're not involved in this just because we want to be some sort of voyeurs or some sort of telling some juicy bits of gossip. We're here to document actual abuse. We're here to actually declare what we see going on, and that's why we were involved in this document to begin with. It saddens me, to hear, over and over, as you've mentioned, so many finding that their personal guilt and shame at being unable to measure up to that unbelievably unreasonable, abusive perfectionism that Xenos sets before them. And all of its busy work, all of its socializing, all of its demands to be at this being, they're often the first signs of trouble in their minds and hearts within themselves. They believe, well, there must really be something wrong with me if I can't go to 4 meetings a week and spend my money the right way they want me to and not go here and not go there. Was that what led you to start questioning your involvement? Or what were some of the things that really began bringing that to focus in you personally as you began to start looking ahead and considering reassessing your involvement?
Yeah. So, for me, that's really where the rubber hits the road. When in high school, I was very involved, did a lot, was clearly identified as someone in the church organization who had a lot of potential for future leadership. And so I was given opportunities to teach sort of the large group meetings. I was given, leadership responsibilities. There was a lot of praise and even commendation. And so, in high school, a lot of my experience it was committed, it was indoctrination, it was forming my identity and shaping who I was as a person. But for the most part, it was in a positive direction. I was encouraged in a specific direction, not necessarily the direction itself was positive. I think it warped in a lot of ways my view of the world outside of the church. Right. But I was still being encouraged, right? People said, you're doing a good job. You're getting closer to God. In my little small group of best friends who were also in the church, we had started a little Bible study that had 30, 40 members that was coming out in our early years in high school. So we were really praised and recognized within the church for running the course well. We were the elite group who was actually capable of performing according to whatever obstacle course the church had set forth as spirituality. And in
that you found that a personal affirmation that certainly is, a positive thing. It's building you up, but it definitely was going south.
Right. I think it builds you up. It was building me up deeper into the system. Mm-hmm. So they were positively encouraging me to go deeper and deeper into the system. And so, not that they were positively encouraging me to be a young adult or explore my options for life or understand the world in a wider context. I was being trained like almost like a dog in the Westminster Dog Show, right? I was given treats, but where am I going? This isn't a real life. This is, being trained on some arbitrary course.
It's a program. Yeah.
Right. And so I still had, in high school, I had, my family is not in Xenos and never has been in Xenos. And, I obviously a lot of my time was spent in school or sports or with other people, and I stayed at home with my parents. And so there was still as much as I was dedicated, there was maybe even still some healthy balance of separation from the church in other areas of my life. Even though I was incredibly devoted, there was still space for me to be a person, a little bit outside of that organization. But when you transition into college, that's when it all falls apart. And I think it's where the worst abuse happens within the church. So first, I think it's really important, and this has been brought up by a number of people, to say that, I'm very academically capable and gifted. And so, I had perhaps a lot of opportunity to go to any college that I wanted to study whatever I wanted to study. But I was led to believe, through growing up now in the church, that to go anywhere other than Columbus for school would be deeply sinful and a deep rebellion against God.
Yeah.
And so I think, you start to see, I certainly didn't question it. I believed it. I believed that was right. And I willingly chose to go to Ohio State and to pursue a degree in engineering. But I made that decision because I was led by this group to believe that if I had made any other choice, it would be an issue of the rightness of my heart before God. And I think, that gives you a flavor of how intrusive the church is on just even very basic non-moral issues. And this happened to many people. I mean, all of my friends ended up at Ohio State as well, primarily because that's what the church told them was expected of them. And I did it willingly. No one forced me to, but I was trained to run a specific race and to jump through specific hoops, and I jumped through them. Right. And one of those hoops was to go to Ohio State.
Right. They framed the question in such a way as that, of course, you had freedom of will, but there's only one way to answer the question correctly, and that's end up staying in Ohio State, right?
Exactly right. Yeah. And so, that sort of paints the picture as you move into the college group of there are so many questions that only have one right answer in the church.
Right.
And so again, there's pressure, coming in freshman year. According to Ohio State's rules, I was required to live in the dorms my freshman year. But if you got a note and I was from the area and I had family, if you had a note that said you were living at home, say, you could get out of the dorm requirement at OSU. And so I actually did that. And the reason I did that was because one of the right answers that the church presented was that I should move into a ministry house, which you guys have talked a lot about, but it's a house of, it's a single gendered house of a group of people who live together who are a part of a specific home church or small group. So usually you have a women's ministry house and then you have a men's ministry house. And those are the most elite members usually of your home church, the most committed ones, right? The ones who have agreed to, even live with other people in the church, basically expose themselves to the church 100% of the time. And so it was understood that, again, the right spiritual decision to make was to live in a ministry house, not to live at home with your parents, not to live in the dorms where, there's too much exposure to sex and beer and partying and college or whatever these things are. There was a deep, deep fear of that. And so there was a huge pressure to live in the ministry house, which is what I did. And I've heard of other people who have made different decisions to live in the dorms who were shamed for their decision or viewed as less spiritual, or that they had made a mistake, or, maybe their parents wanted them to live in the dorms, but they really should have stood up to their parents and told them, no, it's important for my spirituality to live in the ministry house, right? So again, you have this pressure to conform in a certain way. And as you move into the college group, that what that conforming looks like gets more and more intense. Is I'm no longer at home with my parents. I'm no longer playing sports or going to, getting out of the house, being involved with different groups of people. My life has become almost 100% Xenos 12, which is what they want. And it's what they praise as true spirituality before God. That is definition of the high commitment. And I did it willingly. I mean, to what level you want to ascribe my will at that point in my life, since I was so heavily influenced by the stick, which was the obstacle course, which told me what I was supposed to do. And the carrot was my love of God himself. And so you're confusing these, very serious parts of individual sense of self, identity, value, meaning, purpose. You're confusing them all together and saying you are less before God if you don't make the right choice that we view to be spiritual.
Right. And that's exactly, again, what we're talking about when it comes to viewing Xenos as an abusive cultic movement. I mean, I know, there's all kinds of controversy when you bring up the word, but to me, in my time of working in this, what you're describing is a classical component of what is called of what I understand cultic mind control to be, from the perspective of Dr. Robert Lifton, who's done his classical work on thought reform and totalism. That's the name of his book, actually, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, in which he set forth 8 criteria of what he called thought reform environments. And one of these is a concept called doctrine over person. What you've just described is just that. When you make the demands and the ideology and the dogma of a group or a philosophy or whatever suddenly just absolutely, pale. Your needs actually pale in comparison to that, because the doctrine is flawless. It's perfect. It's the only absolute form of truth. Whereas your experience and your issues and your difficulties don't mean anything. You have to line up with them in order to receive any kind of legitimacy, any kind of actual recognition. If you're going to be recognized, it's going to be because you complied with what the dogma wanted you to do. You're providing a success story, a case study that they're going to look back and say, oh, see, this is a truly whole-souled, true believer that we have here, and you're doing what you did with the Bible study was something that you could only sustain so long. And then when you failed to keep up that high level, like you said, high commitment, as you call it, level of participation, and you find your experience starting to break down, well, obviously it can't be the doctrine's fault. It can't be the ideal. It's you. You're the one making the mistake. You're the one breaking it down. And that's what Lifton called the concept of doctrine over person. It's one of 8. We wouldn't have time to get into some what we've been through, but to me that jumps out, and we had to make a comment simply because you're just beautifully illustrating again just why I believe Xenos really is a cult. And Marx made the same point, and so have you, and so many others. And it's this very concept that I think really helps us see that how dangerous the group really is, and how it became intolerable for you. What was the point at which you began to feel it was becoming too much, and you had to reconsider your involvement?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, college was, and I'm sure it is for very many people, it was a really big step. And so, I was in an honors engineering program at Ohio State freshman year, and it was very difficult. It required a lot of commitment to the program, to studying, to doing the projects with my classmates. Is a hard thing to do. I mean, most of the people who were in that program were doing it full time, right?
Right.
But I had essentially a secondary career on the side, and that was my career, or my commitment to Xenos and the church. And so, it was probably just 9 months into my freshman year when I reached the point of complete burnout. And, I never from within the church actually questioned the church itself. I did more questioning of the church in the years after I left, and trying to understand what had happened to me. Because, when I was in college, I desperately wanted to follow God. And I knew that, going to all the meetings, or at least I thought that going to all the meetings that they required of me, living in the ministry house, serving the girls who I was living with, making sure that their needs were met, all of those things were important to me. And I wanted to do them all, but it got to the point where I physically could not. What would happen is, there's one obvious thing that has to give in the Xenos mentality. And what had to give was my education. What had to give was hearing or school, my disciple had counseled me, my discipler, whose name is, and maybe I'll just name a few of the people in my group because they're quite high up in the church now. So I was in sort of a, flagship or high profile, home church. There are many home churches than the college group, but the one that I was a part of, when I was in Xenos as a college student was particularly high profile. It had a lot of these people who were recognized in the system as being very spiritual or very committed to God, very influential within the organization. And as it turns out, a lot of those people have gone on today to hold very senior positions within the church.
Okay.
So, at the time I was discipled by a woman named Sarah Faust. She was married to a man named Ben Faust, who is now a senior sphere leader, within the church. So he oversees, numerous, home church groups. And both of Ben and Sarah were leaders in my home church in 2006 when I was in school. Also leaders in my group were, Paul Alexander and Becky Alexander, who, were married, and Paul has gone on, I believe he does maybe, counseling, individual home church counseling. And he also hosts the Xenos Dwell podcast, that exists now. It's called Dwell on These Things, which, it's actually really interesting to listen to. You can see the same, types of things I've been talking about being propagated in the church today.
Mm-hmm. Wasn't he on that NBC interview?
Yeah. Paul was also interviewed, although he wasn't speaking, my understanding is he wasn't speaking formally on behalf of the church. He was, a part of the NBC interview, where he was giving a response or his view on the church.
Yeah, his perspective, yeah.
Right. And I watched that with great interest, and I've had some interactions with Paul since that that weren't very effective. But I watched that with interest because there's so much that the church has come out and said, we don't have any examples of abuse. We haven't seen it. Maybe there's, things where people's feelings got hurt or they had interpersonal conflict, or maybe there's examples of, immature leaders did a one-off bad thing that hurt someone and that shouldn't have happened, but it's not a structural issue, right? This is
we have training courses and papers written about this, so obviously we're on top of it, right?
Right. And I struggle a lot to understand or come to a conclusion about what level of awareness actually exists within the senior leadership of the church in terms of, the complaints and allegations of abuse, that are circulating now. However, I do know that these individuals, some of them whom, including Paul, has responded publicly to these accusations. He was a leader in my home church while all of this was happening to me. Mm-hmm. And so that doesn't necessarily make him, aware or directly culpable or anything like that. But it to me, I look at it and say, you have an obligation to understand what's going on here, understand the damage that you're individuals, right?
And Paul really, in recalling the full interview that's on the NBC News website, by the way, you can see the whole thing. It's still up there, I believe. And watching him, you can see he's talking all around it up to the problem, to really just admitting that there's an issue. He all but admits that there are. There are larger issues here involved. There's actually a systemic form of this abuse going on that they're just not willing to talk about, go any further about, since he obviously wasn't speaking for Dwell, but it's there. And when we directly spoke with Kate and Conrad, yeah, thank you, Kate and Conrad directly about that, they were completely tone deaf, as you point out, to what we were saying, and and why do you think that is? Even now, are we maybe early on in the process of making people accountable? But why is it that we could talk to them or speak with them and listen and tell them we had 20 people who were abused and were expelled or walked away from Dwell/Xenos because of all these issues from all different walks of life who didn't hardly even know each other until we brought them together for a meeting together where we interviewed some of them. Why is it you can list all this and tell me that they're still isolated? Why do you think that there's this like you mentioned this emotional distance? I mean, there was absolutely nothing, no connection, no compassion, no connection, no desire to really understand. It just this flat tone of denial. Why do you think it's like that in Xenos right now, in the leadership anyway?
Yeah, I think, it's the $1 million question, to be sure. And I think, I'd first just start by saying that every individual within that group is unique and has their own personality, motivations, nuance, and the way they think about the organization. I think there's probably a lot of ways that people within the group reconcile to themselves what has happened and what these allegations of abuse mean and that sort of thing. So I don't think that there's just one answer. Right. I do think that there are structural issues that make it easier to look away from or deny that it truly is abuse, or in the worst case, say, well, maybe it was abused by some cultural standard, but it's an acceptable loss because it's doing the work of God and saving souls, right? So yeah. People deal with it at different levels. I think the primary reason that you see, I think you're right when you talk about Conrad and Kate, the interview you did, you see an astounding tone deafness, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to even write about this, understand it, speak out about it, because I think that that's something I've been trying to reconcile to myself for the past 20 years is, I've been in this organization and I can empathize and understand the logic and the indoctrination and, the closed perspective and all of these things. And then you see it from the outside and to recognize, wow, I was abused in a system of vast authoritarian scope that touched me at a very intimate level as a human being when I was much too young, when I was still a child, right?
Right.
And so, when I answer that question, I think about it in a couple ways. And I think the first thing to point out is that the church itself is so insulated from the outside world. The only real touch points and interaction that the church has with the outside world is through the laser focus of evangelism. So they want to convert people into the organization. But a lot of people do not maintain friendships or relationships outside of the church with people of different faiths, people who go to different churches even, people who don't believe in God. Those people are not worthwhile targets for evangelism. And so for the same reason, the church doesn't maintain relationships with people who have left or been kicked out or asked to leave. And so that is your group of abused people. And the church has turned their eyes and ears and face away from that abuse. They can't see it. They don't understand it. They've hardly even heard the stories. And so they're not, I think even in the past couple of years, this is the first time, a lot of the church has even had to reckon with this on a real public level in terms of the attention. Because when I left the group in 2006, and when my friends who were right there alongside me through high school and college also left the group, and we each suffered with our own deep traumas from the organization, but we suffered in isolation. We didn't understand what happened to us. I was ashamed and embarrassed that I had failed God. Right. I didn't think that they had done anything wrong to me. I thought I had failed, right? And so we didn't speak out. They haven't heard from me for 16 years for the most part. And so they fundamentally don't see that pain. They don't walk alongside it. They don't understand it. You, Raphael, your team does the work of picking up the pieces and walking alongside the people who have been damaged this way. So you understand it, but they don't understand it. They don't even know it exists. They are insulated from it entirely.
Yeah.
And so I think that is the first piece of an incredibly complicated puzzle of cognitive dissonance and indoctrination and, all of this that goes into it. I don't think that the people within, Xenos, well, for the most part, I think many of them are well-intentioned. They want to follow God and
totally.
They want
I truly believe that. I've never stopped. I may decry the system as evil. I may decry some of what they do as evil, and I think at some level there is evil. But there, like you said, there's 90% of the people that are there for the right reasons. They're just held by an evil system that's wrong.
Right. And that's why, I say too, it's like, I was going through all of this and struggling. I mean, when I'm struggling in college with how do I balance my work commitments and my school commitments and my church commitments? How do I balance all this and how do I get that balance right? Xenos only had one black and white answer for me. It was you focus on church and that's it. Everything else has to give. Everything else has to go. And so I was able to change my major or to drop classes or to get lower grades or to stop trying so hard. I was, for me, it was painted as school is an idol for you. You idolize it, and therefore you have to give it up. I mean, they will find anything that you love or value or enjoy, and they will drive you to submitting to God and expelling that piece from your life in service of the church or in service of the group. Right?
Yeah.
And so I think, the second piece of that puzzle is even how busy they keep people. I've even had conversations with a good friend of mine who, came around with our group of friends in middle school and high school, and he's still in the church. And I've had conversations with him over the past month or so, saying, if you want to talk about this, I'm open to talking about the perspective. If you're confused on, where all these people are coming from, here's a paper that I wrote. And, I get in response, yes, I'd love to know about it and I'll get to it when I have time. But the problem is the system is so intensive with all the other cares of life that you never have time. Right. You're kept so busy all the time, right? And so I think that's a second piece of the puzzle of why people can't see it from within the church.
Mm-hmm.
I think the third piece, especially at the high levels of leadership, I think there's a huge level of cognitive dissonance where, these people have dedicated their entire lives to this system of belief. And I have a lot of empathy for them. I mean, if it weren't for almost sheer happenstance of what happened when I was in college, I might still be in this church. I might be on the other side of the table and the person that you're questioning, alongside Conrad and Kate. And so I have a lot of empathy for that position and the inability to see it. And I think a lot of that is that insulated culture and the cognitive dissonance that says we think we know the absolute truth, the capital T truth of what God asked us to do. And we're pursuing that and we're following it to a T. And therefore there cannot be abuse.
Right.
They answered the question, before it was even asked.
There's a terminal devotion to that ideal.
Right, exactly. We're following God. We're doing what's right and what's important in life and what God asked us to do. That intrinsically means that this was not abuse. And so even if they can come alongside some of the people who have been really hurt by the organization, they may say, well, that was bad leadership or that was a messy said, she said situation. We'll dismiss it and trivialize it in any way, but they cannot see it as systemic in the organization. Because that would upend the whole endeavor, right? It would, topple an entire system that you devoted your life.
There's too much at stake. There's
Right.
way too much at stake. I mean, if you admit you're wrong to this degree, the crushing moral weight would be, I think, more than most people could bear. And frankly, it would open up all kinds of legal and personal and financial and social consequences that an organization like Xenos couldn't weather. They've done a lot of weathering over 50 years of a lot of damage control, but this would be one fatal blow. This would be the iceberg for their Titanic that they simply could not do and that would be by actually becoming vulnerable and doing the right thing and actually understanding that, hey, maybe a little humility might help in understanding that they really could be wrong at some point.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's difficult, and it's important to understand that. That's where, I would like that I can speak with some sort of empathy for the organization itself, despite how I can see the terrible and cruel effects that it's had in people's lives.
Yeah.
It's this complicated idea of saying that I was both abused by this organization and I was also an abuser, right? I mean, you talked to my good girlfriend, Jessica, on one of your previous podcasts, and, she had her own, we were very good friends in high school and early college, and she had her own sort of conflicts and exit from the church and things that she struggled with that, she struggled with largely in isolation. And even though we were very good friends, there was this idea that she was walking away from God. She was sinful. She was almost dangerous. Like if you hung out with her, she might pull you down into the satanic world of her own sin and mess and rebellion, right? And so, I remember the church still believed in and upheld that position. I still loved her, but I wouldn't, go hang out with her because, it could be too dangerous and she might lead me away into her satanic mess. And, that's the sort of ideology that is so dangerous, that when I take a step back now as an adult, what I see is that, between my three friends who are very involved in that church and who are deeply traumatized by it, I look and we all suffered alone and in isolation. Even though we had been best friends within the church, we suffered on our own. And it took years for us to share our stories with one another about what we had experienced. You'd think it'd be natural that we just get out of the church and run to the people who had already left. But there's so much deep shame and trauma and embarrassment that we didn't, and there were no websites, there were no blogs, there was no people talking. We were all just alone and muddling through it. And so, I can with confidence say that I've been on both sides of that. I have both been the abused and been the abuser. And I think it's that type of nuance that the church cannot acknowledge and has difficulty seeing. That's part of that black and white idealistic mentality that it holds.
Yeah.
These things, understand this type of abuse, this type of systemic problem within an organization, you have to understand the deep motivations of individuals. You have to understand the nuance of people and how they relate to one another and how they're affected at different levels of their life, right? And that's not what they do well in this group, right? They do black and white, right and wrong. Here's the answer. That's not the answer. And so you're not a part of the group anymore, right? And so I think all of that plays into the complicated nature that both creates this type of abuse and prevents them from seeing it. Yeah. And as well as I do, that there is a stream of people flowing out of that organization on a daily basis that has been deeply traumatized, and that I can speak to it 16 years later. That trauma's not gone. It touches every area of my life. I mean, my good friends today joke that they too have been, traumatized by Xenos Dwell by default, just by, all they've spent listening to me talk about it and helping me understand
And
right?
what I've learned over the years, in counseling people and listening to people tell their stories, like I said, I'm not a therapist. I'm a pastoral counselor, but I do provide opening ears, as all pastors do, to people who are troubled. And that's what I've done. And listening to people coming out of groups like Xenos, excuse me, listening to that, I learned pretty much the same thing, that people sometimes leave and then suffer in silence for years and never ever deal with it. I mean, and it's partly because of that factor, that they don't know that there's any other way to live other than that. They're just left terminally suffering in this horrible cesspool of pain. And then at the same time, they never, I've learned at the same time I have learned in talking to them is that a lot of people, don't want to deal with it. They just would rather move beyond and pretend it never happened. That people in pain, no one has the same reaction. I mean, physical pain's one thing. Everyone understands. Hey, you hit your thumb, ow. You stop hitting your thumb, okay? But when you get spiritually impacted by one thing, different people do different things. They handle the internal pain, the cognitive dissonance, the abuse, the shame, the guilting. They handle it differently, again, it's far more impacting than even the horrible crime of rape. I mean, it's such an unbelievably, intimate, invasion of privacy where everything personal, everything private you want to hold is completely ripped away and publicly exposed. It's hung out to dry. And to take that back and deal with the consequences of you personally, even years later, most people just want to cover over with a nice thick piece of skin. And a lot of people don't do well with that. They don't do well with that. They struggle. They suffer. Some people sadly, resort to suicide, resort to drug abuse, resort to endless relationships or steam and rage and anger, all kinds of stuff like that, so it's very sad that an organization set out to advance the Christian faith as the abundant life does just the opposite. It creates so much abundant death. That's the tragic thing of that. So, well, we try to keep these podcasts about an hour. We're going a little over that, and that's fine. But in closing, we do want to, I guess I want to give you a little more time here with this, but in closing, toward that thought, what would you say to people who are maybe on the fence right now listening? What would you say to, let's say you actually had Dennis McCallum and others, Conrad and others listening in right now. What would you say to them? What would you want to say? Maybe there are friends and people that may still be there, may not be. But what would you say to people who are on the fence, who are at different levels of involvement in their life, but are all still in some way, shape, or form bewitched by the Xenos vision, by the whole thing? What would you say to them right now if you had a chance? And maybe there's something you might want to close with on that, and just kind of letting us know how you feel about that. What would you say to them?
Yeah, it's so difficult. I mean,
I know.
I think what I would say is that, I understand. I've stood on both sides of the fence. But what I do believe is that I do believe that the stream of people who are telling these stories, though they may struggle to articulate them in a way that is clear to those in the church, that these people have been deeply wounded by the systemic structure of the organization, I do in fact believe that that's the case. And I believe that these folks have been deeply abused, and used in a spiritual sense that is the most fundamental, personal, and private area of anyone's life, and that is deeply destructive. And often that does not come with any physical evidence. It may not even come with a fancy story that sounds dramatic or terrible to the outside world. And that's what really leads to the suffering of these individuals, that is so difficult, is because they have very little to point to say, this was deeply destructive to me as a human being, deeply destructive to my soul. They don't have a scar. They don't have, a intense story about how people wronged them, because it's the system itself that caused this abuse and damage, and it's propagated by the individuals within the group who cannot see it, right? And so, to the people who are still in the church, I would say, I think a lot of them, like I did, they want to follow God and they want to care for people and love people in real ways. And I would say, well, you have to sit with the idea that the stream of people has been deeply traumatized by this organization. And how is that consistent with the love of God?
Yeah.
How did we misunderstand, the care and the protection and the sacredness of the space that the church is working in? If you want to play in the sacred spiritual dimension of human beings' lives, that's a special place that you need to behave carefully in. And I think a lot of the structures of the church have overstepped that bound and have really failed to recognize how formative the area is that they're playing in. They've missed the forest for the trees. And I think that's just something that those in the church really need to sit with. Everything I've written and thought about this issue is written with a hope and a belief that people can see and know that within the church, and that they can make actual changes. I think even at the very senior levels, I think it's hard, it's difficult, but it's time for a reckoning. My intention in speaking out on all of this is not to get any personal vindication for myself. It is what it is, and I've dealt with what happened to me, and I am the person I am now because of it. The reason why I think it's important to talk about this is because people are still being wounded the way I was wounded 20 years ago. And it's terrible. I wouldn't wish that upon anyone. And it affects people for a lifetime. And so people need to take that seriously and really think about it.
Right.
I guess just to end, there's a Bible verse I just wanted to read and share that I think is perfect to speak to the issues within the church. And so perhaps I'll just read it to you.
Go ahead.
It's Ezekiel 34:4 says, "You have not strengthened the weak. You have not healed the sick. You have not bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strayed. You have not sought the lost, but with force and harshness you have ruled them." And I think that's the position that Xenos really needs to look into.
Mm-hmm.
Have you answered this call from God, and have you done it as an organization? Because it would seem that the opposite is the case.
Right. And the tragic, the piteous part of all this that I personally see, I mean, and you reading that verse just spins me back to, 30 years ago, when I was called into ministry, and I mean, not 30 years ago, longer than 40 years ago, when that very verse, Ezekiel 34, jumped off the page as I was reading it when I was a very young Christian, just got out of the Navy, fresh, all the sea salt still behind my ears. And that very verse jumped off the page and it spoke to me. And it made me understand that there really was in the land a group of people who would pose themselves as the height of spiritual perfection, as the great moral repositors of the nation of Israel, who would then be so bad, lead so horribly. And that makes it all, I think, that gives the greatest context. I appreciate you picking that, because that's the very chapter I cited heavily in one of the Xenos articles there, is that very verse in Ezekiel 34 is really, I think, where the rubber meets the road, and it really does give the classical biblical perspective on what spiritual and religious abuse are and what God's view is on it. God does care It does matter to him what people do in secret places in his name. It matters on the most deepest way, because he brings it out. He shouts it from the rooftops. And to those who are in leadership, to those who are elite, who are followers, who have been part of a system that's just turning people into spiritual hamburger. I mean, it's time for you to understand that a judgment is coming, and whether it's in this world or next, one is coming. And I would hate to be the one that hears from that goes before Christ at the judgment seat and say, "Oh, did I not create a megachurch for you? Did I not create all kinds of great spiritual structures for you? Did we not get thousands of people in and out of our summer institutes?" And Jesus looked down at you and say, "I never knew you. Get away from me, you workers of iniquity." That's not something I will want to wish on anybody. But and to your point, that's exactly what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to hopefully, as we said, not try to burn down the church, but to call it to open its eyes and see what it needs to be doing. And then it's no longer living in denial, but actually taking to heart what is being told by its own brothers and sisters. And I thank you so much for bringing that up there and for that wonderful close, Katie. It's been a delight to have you on, and we are hoping to have you on again real soon in a special project that we're working on right now. And I really, once again, appreciate all you've been able to share with us here today. And thank you, and look forward to seeing you again sometime.
Yeah, thank you so much, Raphael. I really appreciate the work that your group is doing.
Thank you, and we appreciate what let me see, I got the URL right. dwellcommunitychurchisaccult.com is Dwell.
Dwell Church Columbus is a cult.com.
Okay, all right, yeah, I'm gonna get that yet. I'm gonna get that straight. It's a little, but you have to do what you have to do to get it out there, and I appreciate that. Thank you so much again, and we'll look forward to. We're gonna have that URL. I'll have your address up on our website links and stuff like that. We'll get that very soon. But thank you once again for sharing so much.
All right, thanks, Raphael.
Thanks for listening today as we explore just where are we going. Our prayer is that you have been encouraged and strengthened, and if necessary, challenged in your daily journey through life. Jesus is coming. You can fall with the night, or you can rise with the sun. The choice is yours. You can email us with questions and comments at feedback@spiritwatch.org. And if you need urgent personal spiritual help, email us at help@spiritwatch.org. We look forward to hearing from you. Please follow our podcasting at our Facebook page and our website at spiritwatch.org. This podcast is a production of Spirit Watch Ministries, taking heed that no man deceives you.